Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tom Burke. I'm the chairman and co-founder of E3G, and I'll be moderating the session this afternoon. With me is Nick Mabey, the CEO of another co-founder of E3G, and a friend of COP, one of the formal friends of COP, and has been in the room in a lot of the high-level discussions that have gone on recently around the preparations for Glasgow, and Seema Kamurie, who's now the head of E3G's Better Recovery Unit and is a former official in the French Treasury and an advisor to the French Foreign Minister. So that's our team for this afternoon, where we're really addressing the forthcoming G7, which I think in many ways is probably going to be the most consequential G7 that's ever taken place, given the gravity of the issues in front of us, in particular timing. And it's therefore also, perhaps also the most critical moment on the road to Glasgow. Challenges for the G7, can the leaders bring together enough cooperative effort to contain the competitive drives that are forcing nations apart at the moment? Can they align their efforts around vaccine and sharing the vaccine, around recovery from the consequences of the pandemic and climate change, so they add together rather than get in each other's way? And I suppose particularly for Britain's Prime Minister, this is a real challenge to him to get a successful G7, and in doing so, breathe some life in to the notion of global Britain. So that's the agenda, if you like, for this afternoon. I'm going to just move right away to Nick and ask Nick to open up on those sort of broad themes. Nick.
Brilliant, thanks a lot, Tom. And as Tom said, I'm a friend of COP, which means I advise the COP. And in my E3G capacity on this call, not any relationship to the UK. I'm going to try and cover the kind of broad space of politics and climate going into the G7 in three areas. Firstly, where are we on the way to Glasgow and on climate action more broadly in 2021? Secondly, why the G7 is such a critical tipping point for climate action and what would be the benchmarks for success? And then thirdly, where next from Cornwall? How do we get from Cornwall? What are the scenarios that might take us to COP and the stepping stones forward? So firstly, just to remind, what are we trying to achieve this year? What do we have to achieve this year? Well, firstly, we need to get more climate mitigation ambition on the table if we are, in the new term of arts, to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And this is now, I suppose, moved on from net zero as being the aim of the COP, as talked about by Alok Sharma, the COP president, and John Kerry from the US, and even in the US-China statement. I think that's the new benchmark for what COP is trying to do. Secondly, in the real economy, we need this year to shape some radical economic and investment shifts to make those nice targets a reality, especially in the G20. And that also means ending most fossil investment in the early 2020s, if you look at the latest IEA report, not least through shaping the COVID recovery. And finally, we need to keep confidence in the overall Paris architecture for solving climate change. And that's both mitigating climate change and delivering on the social contract of Paris, which was about helping countries to transition to a low carbon economy, but also helping them respond to the impacts of climate change. And we need that confidence in politicians, but also investors and the public, if COP is going to be a success. So it can't just be a success in the room, it has to be a success, or enough of a success on the street as well. So where are we following the beginning of the year with a Biden summit, with the G7 meeting on environment and climate as well? Well, we've made progress, but we're still well away from even a well below 2 path, the main aim of the Paris Agreement, let alone the 1.5 goal that's now emerging as the new standard. The G7 made some big progress, I think, on stopping international coal finance from South Korea, though Japan seems to be pushing back a bit now. The G7 agreed to effectively get out of coal in the 2030s and to limit further fossil finance in gas and oil going beyond. Unfortunately, the language they agreed was very fuzzy, and there's a real question about whether the leaders can tighten it up so it's a more credible context. We've seen some really good progress on structural reform on finance, which we'll come back to, the IMF, private investors, which was very instrumental in driving the kind of push on oil companies' boards and the action we saw last year at kind of Black Wednesday. We've seen China move on from setting targets to putting in place a very impressive internal policy process to meet its goals. But it's still not signaling it's going to raise ambition. And really, China is, now the big G7 economies and OECD have moved, is really the one we need to move to get anywhere near a credible agreement at Glasgow. And by worrying, China is starting to kind of rumble over the issue of border adjustments, which we'll probably talk about in the Q&A, particularly in its recent speech of the Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister, at the P4G summit in South Korea. So we don't think the foundations for an increase, a major increase of ambition before COP are in place. And we usually talk about these in three ways: geopolitical, solidarity, and financial ambition foundations. So geopolitically, despite increased tensions between US, Europe and others, and China and Russia, climate change does seem to be acting as a bit of a glue in the international system. It's stopping the extremes. China is certainly positioning climate and vaccine diplomacy as part of its positive geopolitical offer. So we're kind of, that's good. There were scenarios which were much more tense, much more fragmented. So we're seeing that kind of convergence and climate being a place where people cooperate. In terms of solidarity with developing countries, there's still tensions over vaccine and vaccine access. And we're still seeing the kind of threat to face-to-face talks in Glasgow, though we haven't seen vaccine issues spill over into the climate talks yet, partly because people are waiting to see what the G7 is going to agree, and partly because there's been some movement on financing. But I think the real issue, and we're going to focus on this today, is the financial foundations for action. Recovery is faster than people were expecting last year, in many ways because there's been more policy intervention in rich countries and China, but also because of the vaccines coming on faster than people expected. But it's very unequal, and many middle-income and low-income countries are struggling to access finance, struggling with debt, particularly those dependent on tourism and commodities, who are also being hit by climate impacts, droughts at the moment. So for many countries who we need to see ambition from in Glasgow, they have no ability to invest in clean technology or economic resilience, even if it makes economic sense, because they just can't mobilize the funding. So green recovery outside the EU isn't really emerging. We're waiting for the Biden infrastructure package. UK and Japan are really lagging behind, to be honest, in pushing forward on the green recoveries. And actually, Italy is emerging as a front runner, which is really important for the G20 dynamics going forward. So what does that mean in terms of the role of the G7? So the way this year is going to roll out, as we see it, is the G7 needs to really show leadership on ambition, on 1.5 alignment in all their policies, including external finance, on green recovery, if they're going to flip the pressure onto China and the others in the G20 to really match them and deliver the ambition we need to go into Glasgow, because we are way away from reaching the benchmark of progress. But unless we also deliver on support for developing countries, on COVID, on the $100 billion climate finance promise, on a major increase in structural finance so they can actually invest in their future development and don't suffer a lost decade of investment, there won't be any space for discussions of climate ambition in Glasgow. We'll just be talking about finance. And that's why the G7 is such a critical tipping point, because it's really the last point in the year where we can get that kind of major package from developed countries to deliver, or start to deliver, because they may not do everything on this agenda. And if we miss this point, we'll really pull the foundations away from COP as a transformational moment. And what we risk is having to have a kind of last minute scramble in August among leaders, which really raises the risk of a Copenhagen moment where leaders come in to try and save a process that generally hasn't been built up solidly through the year. And that is compounded by the problems with Zoom diplomacy that are getting in the way of building the type of relationships and engagement that really always makes these multilateral processes work. And if that happens, we won't meet the climate aims of the G7, but that also means the geopolitical aims, which the UK, the US and others have for the G7 to show that solidarity between the democracies, between the developed countries against autocracies, not just China, but that positioning of them as a positive force in the world, working together, not competing, as Tom said. If we don't deliver on health, if we don't deliver on recovery, we don't deliver on climate, that will be an empty shell. So climate is a critical litmus test as part of that package, but climate is also integrated in the other pieces. So what are the concrete benchmarks for success? Well, firstly, the number one priority of the G7 will be the COVID and health package, and it needs to pass the solidarity test showing the G7 is serious. The UK has placed climate as its number two priority for the G7, and we see that cemented in the agenda despite other issues that have been raised. And we need some concrete moves. So on eliminating coal, so the major outcome of Glasgow put forward by the UK, no more coal. We need tighter language on all those issues about international finance, domestic phase out. We also want to see hopefully some support for South Africa and some other big developing countries like India to commit to phasing out coal or stopping new coal. Can we call a coal-free G7 by 2035? That'll be the litmus test we're looking for. There will be some pressure on vehicles to phase out internal combustion engines by 2035. I think there's a slightly lower likelihood of that. It's still quite early in the day for particularly the Americans to move on that. And we need to see real pressure on the 100 billion finance pledge, not because 100 billion is all the finance we need, but because it's a key part of the politics. And that's where Boris Johnson will be under huge pressure and is, as we know from today, to reverse the tactical cut in aid. It's very hard for the UK to ask others to do more when they're the only G7 country cutting aid. And so that's a big political part of this package. And then finally on recovery and the big money, how do we make this a decade of transformational investment? Well, firstly, we need some coordinated green recovery between the whole G7, and Seema's going to talk to that. We need a signal of increased firepower for the big international institutions like the World Bank, so they can lend more. They need to double their ability to lend to other countries, to leverage in the private sector if we're serious. And in return for that firepower, they need to reform faster, get out of fossil fuels faster. There's been some progress, but not enough in terms of those banks actually aligning with the Paris Agreement, which they committed to do in 2015, and they meant to report back on by COP, but they still aren't doing enough in our view. And then the last big delivery initiative, which started to come out in the media, is this idea of a clean and green initiative, where the G7 and other countries align their support for developing countries around high quality, high standard investment, really giving a much clearer, much more useful offer to countries to move. And that is backed by private sector funding and private sector reforms, which again, Seema is going to cover, because there's a whole set of big structural reforms on regulation, etc., which the G7's going to move, that all come together in this idea of how do we fund the transition and the transformation and the recovery this year. So where are we now, quickly? Well, health is looking promising. We're seeing intense diplomacy led by the UK on coal, cars, this climate finance agenda. We hope to see movement, but it's still unclear. Unfortunately, on recovery and the big finance is really lagging. We're not seeing leadership among economic ministers. The French showed some leadership in their summit with Africa recently, a few weeks ago, but Yellen and others haven't really stepped up. Good language, but we're not seeing that inside the negotiating rooms. And really leaders need to put pressure on their finance ministers. So it's not just a debate between countries, but within countries about priorities. And really where that leaves us is the G7, we feel, is on a real knife edge in terms of its ability to deliver the foundations for COP26 that meet the need of the planet and the expectations of the public. And that's why this kind of final run-in is so critical in terms of putting pressure on countries to deliver more. What will happen after Cornwall? There's three scenarios: muddle through, reboot, or accelerate. If we don't get what we need from the G7, there's a risk we just try and muddle through to COP, as I said before, and it ends up in the risk of a Copenhagen type scenario where leaders have to come in and try and rescue a process that really hasn't been built up carefully. We could try and reboot, and particularly the US and EU working together. There's a summit coming up soon, and the Venice G20 summit, really to kind of take the leadership away from the COP president and try and drive it through the G20. That's where France, Italy, the US is key, but that's a lot harder. Hopefully we'll get the foundations where the G7 allows us to accelerate the process through to the UN General Assembly in September, where we expect countries to come forward with more ambition, to the World Bank IMF meetings, where we hope to see some big reforms and changes, and then the G20 in October, where hopefully the G20 will take the stimulus on the signal from the G7 to move forward. And we're also looking for some big deals between countries like Indonesia and others who can get off coal and move in a more sustainable direction. So those are the foundations which will give us, going into Glasgow, the potential to do a bigger, stronger deal in Glasgow, which actually starts to be transformational and shift a credible plan to bridge the gap to 1.5 over the next 5 or 10 years, and protect people from climate change. And I think that's where, you know, as Tom said, the G7 is truly the most consequential G7 we've seen for a long time. It's not just about leaders signaling intent for Glasgow, it's about them actually delivering the foundations for finance and politics, which makes Glasgow deliverable. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Seema, but money is what really matters, and you probably know more about what's happening around the money than anybody. Do you want to take us through that?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. So Nick spoke about the reason why the G7 was absolutely essential to lead us into a successful G20, the key nexus here between the G7, the G20, and the role that this plays for Glasgow. He also mentioned the finance package amongst other priorities, and I would really like us to zoom in on this. And what is the finance package that we're talking about? Why is it absolutely essential this year? The reason why it's essential is very simple. It's because of the pandemic and because of the resulting economic crisis. The crisis triggered by COVID has triggered expansionary economic policies wherever possible. So in other words, it has generated public spending on a highly ambitious scale for at least those countries that can afford it. On the other hand, and Nick touched upon that and the risk of a great divergence in the words of Kristalina Georgieva, those who do not have the means to spend today are facing significant risks, both on the health front, on the economic front, and of course on the climate front. And they often happen to be those countries that are most climate vulnerable. So the bottom line really is that the fundamental question this year is, what are we doing with money? What are we doing both with public money and with private money? And are we creating the right rules to govern this money? This is really what this year is about. And this is the question that's going to lead us potentially into the transformational socioeconomic change we need to be able to address the climate risk. So if we break this down, this question about money and what we're doing with it, there are really 3 questions that are nested within this major question. The first is, are G7 countries spending enough, and are they spending right at home? Second question is, are we giving money as the G7 helping out those who need it on the financial front and giving them the means, empowering them to spend in the way they need to, in the way that's correct right now? And the third question is, and that's obviously the financial solidarity package I was just referring to and that Nick touched upon as well. And the last question is, are we enabling, as governments, our G7 governments, enabling the private sector to also spend things right? So the key here is not just, are we putting enough money on the table? It's also, are we creating the right set of rules around what to do with this money? Are we creating the right governance to enable a climate safe future as opposed to locking us into an unsustainable path? So this is really the better recovery package that we're after. And so, you know, flowing from these 3 questions, it becomes pretty obvious that there are 3 pillars to this finance package. So the first one is the green recovery at home and looking at those efforts that are being made domestically. The second is, are we doing what it takes to enable a green and healthy recovery for all, i.e. financial solidarity? And again, the third pillar is private sector reform and financial regulation to make sure that private investment goes to the right places. So if we break this down, I thought it would be helpful for us to just stop for a second and take a look at what we're actually seeing happen on this package and on these 3 pillars, on these 3 fronts. So on the last 2 pillars, actually, there is some progress. Because of the emergency and the attention that's being very naturally drawn to the economic health, climate crisis in low and middle income countries, you know, their house is on fire. It is pulling the attention of policymakers. And so the discussion on the financial solidarity package, and Nick alluded to it, is very much on the policy agenda. And we do expect that there will be solutions offered. Whether they go far enough, whether they're ambitious enough remains to be seen. But there will be commitments made in the next few months on issuing and reallocating special drawing rights and making sure that they get channeled to the right economic priorities for those countries that need it. There will probably be some progress on the role that multilateral development banks need to play in this transformational decade that's upon us and their Paris alignment. There will probably be some progress as well on rethinking the mandate of the IMF and the way it operates and the way it deploys some of its programs. So that's for the financial solidarity package. And of course, climate finance is part of that discussion and those pledges as well, obviously, but that goes without saying. On the private finance front, we're seeing some positive signals on the disclosures front being required from the private sector. So the likelihood is extremely high. You know, François Villeroy-de-Galhau from the French Central Bank stated that yesterday. I think he was quoted today or this morning in the FT on this. There will very likely be an agreement at the G7 on mandatory disclosure requirements for the private sector. The US recently, with its executive order, also signaled the same thing. So we're very much seeing that movement. Japan is there, France is there, obviously the UK is there and has been there for a while, Canada as well. So no debate on that. Where things are still unclear on this private sector front is how far beyond this are we willing to go? Disclosures are one thing, and enabling transparency is one thing, but is it enough? And that's the key question. And it's not yet clear that the G7 or the G20, for that matter, will really seize this question of, well, why don't we talk about specific norms for what constitutes a green investment and what does not? And that, of course, is the issue of taxonomy, said otherwise. So this remains a big question mark and will become a heated issue throughout the year. Lastly, so I just discussed the last two pillars and the progress and the challenges or questions that we're seeing on those two fronts. But they're on the agenda, right? Where we have real issues, where there is a major gap, and Nick discussed it briefly, is on green recovery at home. So many G7 countries, not all of them, but most of them are putting financial recovery packages on the table, some of them more or less green. Assessing the greenness of these efforts is always challenging. Comparing these efforts is always challenging. But what we know for sure is that the G7 for the moment is not talking about how G7 countries should coordinate amongst each other on these green recovery efforts. This is something that is or should be the basic function of G7 finance ministers. It's a matter of economic efficiency. We know that recovery efforts that are coordinated, that are equally ambitious in the quantity and the quality of the spending are more beneficial to all. This was the recognition and a major drive for creating the G20 in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. We know that there are multiplier effects of coordinated recovery efforts that enhance return on investment and stimulate aggregate demand and ease economic pressure. And by the way, also for those countries that are facing economic difficulties today, there are spillover effects at the global level. But it's not just a matter of economic efficiency, it's also a political imperative, really. G7 countries must lead by example. They must take responsibility for their historic role in driving carbon emissions. And this can only be done if they coordinate and agree on common and ambitious standards that they share across the G7 for domestic green recovery. So what we are seeing right now on this finance package, the major sticking points, the major issue is this gap on not necessarily the green recovery that G7 countries are doing at home per se, but on the lack of coordination amongst G7 countries. The other big tendency that we're seeing regarding the financial package, and Nick mentioned this, and this is important, is this tension between leaders and finance ministers. By all accounts, leaders understood, most of them, understood early on this year that putting enough money on the table was going to be key. Finance ministers, sometimes driven by conservative thinking within finance institutions and finance ministries, have a tendency, structurally speaking, to want to hit the brakes. This is not necessarily true for all countries, but this is certainly a structural tendency that we are still seeing emerging now. We know that when Macron said in March 2020, in one of his speeches about COVID, that he was going to put however money was necessary on the table to tackle this crisis, a little bit like Draghi did in 2012 when he was talking about saving the euro area and talking about doing whatever it took. We know that the finance ministry was not aware necessarily about this and was extremely concerned in France about what were going to be the repercussions on French debt and on the costs to raise French debt. We know that Janet Yellen, and Nick also said that we were seeing some positive language from her, and we certainly have. You know, she talks about how climate needs to be integrated within economic policy, and she recently called on the G7 to put robust fiscal spending on the table. But domestically, she's also made a few statements that say that any recovery package in the US should not be solely or even at all financed through the deficit. It needs to be financed through taxes. Now, when you do that, there's a natural limit to how much you're going to be able to put on the table. So it's also a way of hitting the brakes. So maybe just a few minutes now before I wrap up, or in order to wrap up, on what is it that we need to see? Well, we need to see the right rules emerge from the G7 finance ministers on public spending and on private spending, both. So first of all, we need to see the G7 finance ministers agree on coordinating their green recovery spending at home. This means agreeing on a common floor for green spending policies. Numbers of 30% to 40% are floating around. We think that that's the right ballpark. And at minimum, we also need to see a commitment to having recovery packages that do no harm to the climate and the environment. We also need to see more ambitious rules than what the UK presidency is currently looking at on private spending. Disclosures and relying on the market to adjust and send the right price signals are not enough. We know that we're going to have to create markets in many ways, and this is going to require more specific norms. And we need this discussion to happen at the G7 and at the G20. So these are the rules that we need to see come out of the G7 finance ministers. That's the number one thing we need to see from them. The number two thing we need to see from them is, and that's related to what I just said, is a clear understanding that money this year is more political than ever, and that climate needs to be driven at the heart of their mandate, and that they need to be moving into a political sphere as well and away from technocratic reflexes. That's the second thing we need to see. And I would say the final and perhaps the most important thing we need to see from the G7 finance ministers is European leadership, and especially Italian leadership, French leadership. These are the people we need, and we really need them to show up. I was talking earlier about not just deploying the money, but also creating the rules. And so far, the Europeans are the only one who understand the importance of having both. Very early on, the UK understood the importance of creating some rules to help private investments move along. I was talking about CCFD, but they're not looking at a more ambitious set of rules. And they're also cutting their aid budgets, so that's also an issue. In the US, we're seeing a lot of talk about money at the moment, but the rules are nowhere to be seen. And John Kerry himself spoke of the fact that the US does not believe in excessive regulation when he was touring Europe. So we really need the Europeans to lead the way in this G7. And when you look at the European members or the membership of the G7, Germany's in pre-election mode, and this leaves us with two very obvious candidates. The first is France, the traditional climate champion. Macron, earlier in January in Davos, set out his doctrine or vision, explaining why the international game and the international financial game needed new rules for climate change to be properly addressed, so he gets this. And this also means Italy. Draghi, more than anyone else, having been in another position where another crisis enabled another type of quantum leap, and that's obviously the Eurozone crisis of 2010, 2014, also very much understands what is at stake. Italy is spending a lot right now. They're putting a lot of money on the table. They have one of the highest public debts around, and they're not shy. They're still borrowing a lot of money, more so than anyone else when you look at how much they're borrowing from the Europeans and the Recovery and Resilience Fund. And Italy happens to have the G20 president. So they understand better than anyone else what needs to happen this weekend at the G7 finance ministers, but what also needs to happen next week in Cornwall, and how this will be key to his G20 presidency, how relevant and constructive it will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seema. If questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get them sent through and directed as appropriate. As I like the idea of there being tension between leaders and finance ministers, I think we've had a pretty good example of that in Britain in the last couple of days. But as I listen to that, the financial fire, it seems to me the financial firepower that the Prime Minister assembles and how it's targeted is going to determine whether or not Glasgow can succeed. That seems to me the big thing. So as I listen to that and think about the context, one of the first sort of questions that occurs to me is, if the G7 fails on vaccines, is that also going to lead to failure in Glasgow?
So, Tom, I think it's, the vaccines issue, in a sense, underpins everything else in terms of the tone. And again, it's back to this issue of, we've got a triangle here between the developed countries, the large middle-income countries, particularly China, and the poorer, vulnerable countries. And in this game, developed countries want to put pressure on China and others to up their ambition. They've been reluctant to put more on the table. They've been reluctant to sign up to the 1.5 degree goal. In some ways, this is a fight over how much risk we collectively take, and is 2 degrees enough, or should we go faster? But if that pressure will not happen if the world is still debating over who gets vaccinated, because that will dominate the discussion. It will dominate any idea of global solidarity. There's no point claiming, the developed countries claiming they're having solidarity with developing countries to avoid climate damage in 20 years' time when they're not prepared to help them avoid a pandemic which is raging now. So I think that's why, from the political and a geopolitical point of view, the COVID package is the first step, and then the climate package moves on the back of the COVID package along with the recovery. And you need all three if you're going to succeed this year. And that's hard, because that requires the G7 to do more than it's used to doing. And it means they can't just get away with what's easy. They have to do what's necessary if they want to achieve the goals they've set themselves.
So Nick, if the Prime Minister can't, in a sense, if the vote in Parliament that we are looking for next week on the aid cut, if he can't reverse that aid cut, is that really going to undermine his ability to organize the necessary financial power?
Yeah. Leadership, but obviously, particularly from Biden and Draghi and Macron, there are other people who need to take leadership. So again, sometimes G7s work because the host makes the politics work, and sometimes they work despite the host if others step up. And I think that, but at the moment, the odor, if Johnson wants to make the most out of particularly the Glasgow event, he really needs to reverse the odor cut, because that will give him the standing, or he's going to see other people take over his G7, which is another kind of personal liability for him. And
Seema, I was interested in the analog you made, really, between the famous Draghi moment in the saving the euro, and in a sense the need for something similar now, where essentially the finance ministers say whatever it costs, it's worth it. Who do you think is best placed inside the G7 to actually carry the others? Which is the finance minister or the national leader who could actually get that sort of acceptance that we are at another of these Draghi moments?
Well, I think the answer is it's the same. It's that same person mainly. With Macron, I think the upcoming French elections could also play in favor of this. No doubt that French public finances and who's going to pay for French debt will be a part of the debate. But the reality is we're not out of the crisis yet. We still need to see a proper recovery. So there will be incentive as well for Macron to put more money on the table. I fear that the US will not necessarily show up on that front to the extent that we need them to, in the sense that Biden has a lot of ambition, and the trillions he's putting on the table are impressive in terms of absolute amounts. But when you look at the size of the packages on a yearly basis relative to the size of the US economy, it's not that big of a deal. Those who are putting the most money on the table, by all accounts, are the French and the Italians. Now, when you look at the Germans, there's always going to be this issue of debt and whether or not they can take it. Schäuble, former finance minister, and I'm sure, Draghi must have paid attention to that, just published an article, I think this morning or last night in the FT, talking about how austerity was also a matter of social responsibility. So Germany will never be fully out of these conversations. And because of the difficulties that we're seeing right now with US administration and Congress, I do think that this leaves us with the Franco-Italian couple, especially given the upcoming German elections. So this is who we should be banking on, I believe, Macron and Draghi.
Thanks, Seema. The ghost at the feast for Glasgow in particular is China. So what will China be looking for from the G7, do you think? What will move China to think it needs to do more? What does the G7 have to do to make China feel somehow it's got to join the game?
So this is the, I don't know how many billion-dollar question, given that our ability to read China and dynamics in China has reduced hugely over the last 5 years as power has concentrated around Xi Jinping. But in interpreting their moves at the moment, it's very clear that China wants to be seen as a positive player in multilateralism, wants to stay inside an open global rules-based economy, though it'd quite like to have more say over the rules. And it does, in the year of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, want to show that it's taken seriously on the world stage. So what won't play well in having China kind of carry on, thinking that stepping in and stepping up its ambition on whether it's on vaccines or debt reduction or climate, is looking like the West is forming a kind of containment coalition around China. That just kind of pushes it, the hard line is in the wrong direction. But what does get China's attention is if they think they're going to be outbid. And if we see a strong signal from the G7 that they are taking their responsibility seriously, so China can't point to them and say, you're not being responsible friends of the developing world. We're the largest developing country. We stick up for our comrades in the developing world. If the G7 can say, we're going to give help to those countries and also make it clear they intend to set the rules of the new low carbon climate change economy, which is all about the finance regulation, it's about issues, then China, it can walk away, but a much better position is it for to step in and kind of match their bid. So that would hopefully lead to a race to the top. China's already set a destination for net zero. It's already a world leader in clean industries. It's already a world leader in green finance. There's nothing strategic it's giving up by doing more. It needs to be put in a position where it doesn't look like it's being bullied. It looks like it's responding to a shift in the global environment and the needs of other countries. So that's the tricky tightrope being walked at the moment. And unfortunately, the framing of Cornwall as the kind of democracy 10 and in that way, so a slightly crude geopolitical framing that you hear less at the moment than you did a few months ago, actually pushes China the wrong way. It doesn't attract China in, it pushes China away and makes it easier for them to stand off and say, we're not allowed in this game, so we're going to walk away and play with our own institutions, play with Russia. And if you notice, there was a big China-Russia summit just recently this week where they pledged fealty, and there was a similar one with Saudi. And that's not good for global governance. It's also not good for climate for China to be aligning with big fossil fuel states.
Seema, did you want to add anything on the China question?
Yeah, I wanted to add that actually, this is not necessarily always drawing a lot of attention, but China could have a potentially very interesting role to play on rules for private finance. China was one of the first countries, actually potentially even earlier than the European Union, to have moved on the question of a taxonomy, because they are world leader in the emission of green bonds. And so they very quickly saw the need at home to create essentially green labels or a dictionary for what's green or what's not. And so China and the EU actually have been working very closely together in this new governing body called the International Platform on Sustainable Finance to try to find common grounds for a taxonomy that would be harmonized at the global level. And this is something where I would be really interesting to see China play a role, potentially bringing the US. It's the US who's really the reluctant player on this issue of norms in the G20. I'd be really interested to see the extent to which China can be the go-between, in a sense, between the EU position on norms and the US position on market laissez-faire. So that's something that I think we should pay close attention to. It so happens that China not just co-chairs this work with the EU in this platform I just mentioned, they also happen to be co-chairs with the US on the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the G20. So they're going to be steering the agenda there, and I'll be very curious to see what kind of glue they play on that front.
Thanks, Seema. These very big questions come down sometimes to very precise kind of markers of whether we're in the right place or not. And Chloe Farron from Climate Home News has a question about whether we have a sense that leaders will agree to double their climate financial pledges in the final communique. What's our sense of how that conversation is going?
Well, as I said in the first thing, it is definitely a top level priority for the UK to get out of the G7 leaders level, and they signaled that very clearly when they met with developing countries at the end of March. And we know that this is part of the top level discussion going on between leaders in the run up to G7. There was a lot of pressure put on Germany, particularly to step up, which was disappointed at the Petersburg summit. So in terms of who's in the way, the Germans are being particularly reluctant, the Japanese as well. I think the US would like to be less reluctant. They have got a huge budget on the table. There's a feeling that might be surmountable. Where are we going to get to by next week? Very different readouts from people who are all equally well positioned to claim knowledge. I think it's very turbulent. I'm not sure we'll get a completely clear doubling in the way that would be nice to have. But particularly if the UK moves, I think there will be a last minute push to really include climate finance and come out with a win. I can't see that they can walk away from Cornwall without at least claiming a win, even if it's not as much of a win as we want. And there's going to be a lot of political capital expended on this.
Seema, anything to add to that? What I find very interesting in this moment is are the Merkel years going to, as one of the prime champions of global response to climate change, are they going to end with a whimper as sort of sense Germany becomes reluctant participant in moving things forward? And the paradox in that Merkel, who has been a real architect of stability and a real promoter of stability globally, ends up by not playing a part that would help to ensure a continuance of stability. Seema, you're nodding.
I was nodding because I share your I share your surprise, I would say, in the sense that when in the spring of 2020, Merkel signaled that Germany was finally getting over what was for the country an existential red line, which is to have a federalized European debt to help address COVID, the pandemic and its effects. I was not surprised at all. Merkel was on her way out. This was just exactly the kind of political quantum leap that an exiting leader with her tenure would take, and then she can just go and collect her Nobel Peace Prize. So the position she is taking now, I find also perplexing, to say the least.
I mean, it is what's at stake at this G7. It's whether we actually put the world on track, not just to doing the right thing on climate, but whether we put it on track to retaining basically broad global stability. And it seems to me such a paradox that she wouldn't understand that and understand what Germany could do to preserve what is that core German value.
Yeah, I think the kind of nightmare scenario in a way is, between kind of the difficulties in the Congress at the moment on the infrastructure bill and the budget, and fragmentation in Europe led by Merkel deciding not to leave a legacy behind, exactly the legacy you think she's been working on in her whole time, that everything waits till the new German government comes in, and the coalitions take a while to negotiate, even if we'll see how clear the election is. It is going to have the Greens in a much stronger way in it, whatever the coalition is, and is likely, if you look at the platforms of the parties, to be very forward-leaning on all of these issues, including on the economic issues as well as the climate issues. So, saying we're waiting for the next government is not a good excuse, but if that leaves an awful lot of politics to be built in a very short period of time going into Glasgow, which really raises, I say, the Copenhagen dynamic of where leaders come in to try and save the day at the last minute, which is very, very high risk and will make great copy and great theatre, but has not got a brilliant track record of actually succeeding in terms of aligning 192 countries around both new agreements and new ambition.
It's interesting in the context of what you said, Nick, to remember that the previous German to break one of those extraordinary post-war red lines was a Green foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, who authorized the use of German warplanes in Bosnia, and hence broke ground. So it's possible for Germans to do it. But let me, if there are any more questions, or anybody's got any questions, please put them in now, because we're going to wrap up shortly. But what, to both of you really, what are the consequences if the Prime Minister fails in Cornwall? What are the consequences of that for Glasgow?
Yeah, as I said, I think what we end up with is essentially this, a brave face and a muddling through for the rest of the year. Unless someone else picks up the baton, the UK, this was the UK's big play. And the UK hasn't got any more big plays to make. We're a medium-sized power. The G7 was our show. If the Prime Minister fails to make it deliver, then he hasn't, got really any other shows to play over the year. Obviously, the US can still do things. The EU can still do things. They're great powers. They can actually set the agenda through the year. But it means that, in a sense, the success of Glasgow is out of the UK's hands. They are relying on others to step in and others to use moments, whereas the wonderful thing about having the G7 and the COP in the same year in this order was that the UK had a lot of control of its own diplomatic destiny, and that is an amazing gift to have, especially, as I say, if you're a middle-sized power, even if you're a aspirational middle-sized power, you don't often get those opportunities. And as you said at the beginning, how the UK plays its hand this year will determine hugely how other countries see it as a diplomatic actor going forward, and whether they trust it to deliver on the global stage, as the UK's new diplomatic strategy suggests they will do, by letting it be a broker of global cooperation. This is the test. Can the UK broker global cooperation, or is it not a safe pair of hands anymore?
Well, thank you very much, Nick. That's a very powerful note to end this webinar on. Thank you, Seema, and thank all of you for joining us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.